When consumers don't feel like a retail brand is consistent, it's just compounds that lack of trust that already exists. I mean, the brand has to be consistent. They have to feel like they're not being gamed. And even though it's not intentional, it's just by the design of most companies, that's how consumers end up feeling, is like they're being tricked somehow. It really makes them uneasy. So I think making it integrated is so key.
Well, and it's obviously a hot topic for everybody in this room. Probably everybody is working on something related to making that more seamless. But I think what your research points out is that we have a long way to go in terms of meeting expectations.
Yeah.
Well, I want to kind of talk about the three big shifts. So in your book, you have three big major sociocultural shifts. I want to kind of just go through each one kind of one at a time. And the first one is this notion of rewired brains.
Yeah.
And you're talking about literally rewiring. And can you, like, what exactly is going on in our brains? And then how's that different than 20 years ago before, say, the internet was really fully commercialized? What's really happening?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it has to be said, we are neurologically different than we were 10 years ago. And I'm not just talking about kids. I'm talking about all of us. Because of our use of technology, we think differently than we used to. So a lot of people are really interested in, what can I do with technology to facilitate shopping? What can I do with technology to help people understand my brand? All of that's really interesting and great, but what I'm really interested in, and I think should be paramount importance to people, is what technology is doing to our brains. It's not what we do with it that's really crucial to marketers. It's what it's doing to us, because we literally do think differently. So for one thing, our brains are malleable. They change according to what we use. We get, stronger connections when we use things more, and they dwindle away if we don't. And so what we have now are brains that really are wired for speed. So they skim more. They're more superficial in the way they acquire information, which also means that they have less tolerance for ambiguity and complexity and anything that requires a lot of processing. If they don't see an immediate reward, they just move along because they need it fast.
Is that everybody? I mean, is that all of us? So like as a boomer, our brains, we're raised to focus. Like, I could go in a room for 10, 12, 14 hours and just read and write and focus. But that's kind of changing. And so is it different by generation? So are boomers different than Xers versus millennials? And what are the parallels you draw in terms of the actual rewiring?
So I'll bet you could only go in a room and do that for 8 or 9 hours now.
Yeah,
right?
Less.
But isn't that true? I mean, is there anybody here that thinks that you've got more focus than you did 5 years ago? I mean, probably not. So for people that were raised, I mean, obviously our brains are most malleable when we're youngest, and so we see the effects of this most profoundly with our younger consumers and children. The older you get, the more your brain is already, fairly well established, but that doesn't mean it hasn't changed, and it doesn't mean that 65, 75-year-olds aren't also reporting, again, need for more stimulation. It just takes more impact to break through with this brain that's bombarded with stuff. And there's less patience for focus. I think relationships, I've got a huge section in the book on how that's also affected our relationships, that, we feel more isolated, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but it's also related to our use of technology. So if we're scanners, if we're all becoming scanners, and a lot of this room really has content management as a priority inside their organization, and creating content and organizing content and making the right content available to consumers at different places in the journey, how can you guide us to think about that if we're being rewired to absorb less more quickly, filtering things out? So how do we make sure we're creating the right kind of content and creating value in this world where there's so much clutter going on? Yeah.
How would you guide this audience?
It's more important than ever. I mean, it couldn't be more important, because the structure of the content is really, it's like a meta communication. So if you have a lot of words on a page, really what that says is, you're not communicating effectively, you're not with it, you get the gestalt. In other words, you get all of what the image conveys, but not the nuanced individual parts when you view things with this kind of multitasking, super wired brain. By the way, before I forget, I have another little study for you, because I know you love these, so I thought I'd bring a couple. Which causes you to be less focused and able to concentrate? Smoking a joint, missing a night's sleep, or multitasking?
Which causes you to
lose focus the most, be the most distracted?
Multitasking?
Ding, ding, ding. Indeed. But I would have said smoking a joint. But I didn't do the research. But isn't that interesting? I mean, that's the profound effect. Not that I would personally know, of course, as I'm sure none of you do. But that's the profound effect of these, hyper-wired lives that we have. Our focus is really minimal. So to get back to your question, when you look at the arrangement of content, you have to look at the gestalt, because that's what speedy, fast, superficial brains go for, is what does the collection of all of these images mean, rather than the individual component parts, which is maybe something a senior citizen would still be looking at in a more broken apart way, but not most of us. It's really very fast, very visual, not verbal. Nobody's reading anything. And if you're giving them a lot of words, really all you're doing is saying, I'm old, I haven't kept up, and and I'm, fairly irrelevant, or the lawyers got a hold of my stuff.
And that probably, all those things probably happen. Well, so this need for speed, I guess, one of the things I wonder about, if you think about back like 20 years ago, I had a Performa, that Macintosh computer with dial-up modem, and I remember, things would take a minute to download, and it was forever. And then we got to the place where 20 seconds was reasonable, and then really 8 seconds became like, if you didn't have somebody's attention in 8 seconds, then you lost them. And then more recently, there's been conversation around 3 seconds. And so I guess my question to you, is there a amount of time that a retailer or brand can actually expect a consumer to wait to get what they need? Like, how do we think about time and instantaneousness now?
That's such a good question, but it's so much more complicated than how much time will they spend, because they're also unconsciously developing a perception about the brand that's negative. So although you may get them to wait 3 seconds, which is really long time, I don't actually see people waiting that long. I think that might be old research. If you can get them to wait 3 seconds, they're approaching your brand with an unconscious perception that there's a problem. And that's not what you want. So it's not just about getting things to be seamless and effective. It's also so that they won't leave. It's also so that when they're there, they're admiring you, they're wanting to connect with you, they have a great feeling about you because you're making it so easy, so seamless, and because you're obviously on top of things. One of the side effects of rewired brains is also a really strong belief in newness and in innovation. I used to teach marketing ages and ages ago, and I remember in my MBA classes spending forever talking about the diffusion of innovation and how we can get those early adopters on board. I wouldn't even cover that now, because we're all early adopters.